On a South Carolina street lined with quiet homes, a search began that would eventually involve more than 200 people, a helicopter and drones sweeping the tree line. They were looking for a 4-year-old girl. What investigators would later say is that by the time anyone started looking, the case had already changed. Not a child in danger, a case with no good outcome left. This is the case of Javeayah Harris. For 4 days, Aiken County, South Carolina, became the center of a search unlike anything this community had seen. Search dogs, road blockades, a church that opened its doors as a staging ground for hundreds of volunteers and officers, neighbors who tied up their pets and let strangers walk through their backyards, their sheds, every space nearby that could be checked. At the center of it was a family, a mother, a father, and a little girl described by everyone who knew her the same way: friendly, talkative, smart beyond her years. The public search would end the way few expected, not with her found, with an announcement that changed the entire nature of the case, delivered by a sheriff who called it the hardest moment of his 36-year career. What follows is not a story, it's a record of what happened, pieced together from law enforcement statements, court filings, and public record, starting from before anyone knew her name to the questions that, even now, remain unanswered. Before we continue, a note. This case involves the loss of a young child, and some of what's ahead is emotionally difficult. If that's not what you're looking for today, this is a good place to step away. If you're staying with this one, subscribe now. This case is still active, still developing, and there is more to this story than what made the headlines. Let's begin.
Extremely disturbing, Sydney. The Aiken County Sheriff says Javeayah's parents dissolved her body using chemicals and then poured the rest into a reservoir. What was recovered was immediately sent off for DNA analysis. The sheriff saying this is by far the most difficult and emotionally taxing investigation his office has ever worked.
Before the search, before the sheriff's announcement, before any of it reached the news, there were 2 people whose relationship had already crossed paths with law enforcement more than once. Javeayah's parents were Johmarea Harris and Michilae, 23 and 22 years old. Public records show their history together included at least 2 documented disputes in the months leading up to the events that would make national headlines. The first took place in November of last year, in Clinton, South Carolina, where the family lived at the time. Officers responded to a call at their apartment. According to the police report, the disagreement started over something small, moving furniture inside their home. Harris told officers he and Herring had been arguing since the day before. Herring told police she didn't want Harris's mother and sister coming to pick him up, believing a restraining order kept them away from her. No injuries were reported. No arrests were made. Officers documented it as a verbal dispute and left it at that. The second incident came months later, in March of this year, closer to the date that would change everything. Deputies were called to the family's Aiken County home. The dispute, according to the report, began over Harris wanting to leave in Herring's car. Herring refused, telling deputies Harris didn't have a valid driver's license. What started as an argument escalated when Harris reportedly tried to get her out of the driver's seat so he could take the vehicle himself. Herring told deputies she was calling for help. She also told them she didn't want to press charges. She only wanted him to leave. Both incidents were closed quickly. No charges filed. No follow-up investigations opened. On paper, they were minor domestic disputes, the kind law enforcement responds to and resolves every day in households across the country. There were other threads too, unrelated to those disputes but part of the same public record. Herring had an eviction case in Union County, filed by her housing authority, which ended with a court ruling in the landlord's favor at the start of this year. Harris had an older eviction case from a few years earlier, filed by a separate property management company, which was eventually settled. None of this, on its own, painted a picture of what was coming. Domestic arguments and eviction filings are common enough that they rarely draw attention unless something else happens later that makes investigators look back. And that is exactly what would happen here. By the time detectives began piecing together the full picture of this family, these earlier documents, filed away in separate counties, handled by separate departments, connected to no crime at the time, would become part of a much larger investigation into what had actually happened inside that home. But that story starts somewhere else. It starts with a phone call. Tuesday, June the 30th. Just before 9 in the evening, a call reached Aiken County Dispatch. On the other end was Michilae Harris. She gave her name, then her daughter's, Javeayah, spelling it out letter by letter for the dispatcher, making sure it was recorded correctly. She said she'd been outside with her, that there was a place in the yard where Javeayah liked to spend time, close to a chicken coop the family kept. She said she looked away, went back to check, and her daughter wasn't there anymore. The dispatcher asked routine questions. Was anyone else outside with them? Any other children playing nearby? Any vehicles she'd noticed before she went inside? Harris said no to all of it. She said the yard was set up in a way that Javeayah didn't have many places to wander, which made the moment stranger to her. Then came a question dispatchers ask in almost every missing child case. Does she have any health conditions that responders should know about? Harris's answer wasn't simple. She said Javeayah had been evaluated for autism, but no diagnosis had ever been finalized. In the next breath, she described her daughter differently. Smart, talkative, capable of holding a full conversation with an adult. Two things that don't usually go together in a single description, given side by side, on a call that would later be scrutinized line by line. Harris also told the dispatcher something personal, unprompted. She was 39 weeks pregnant. She said it as an explanation, almost an apology, that she couldn't move the way she normally would, couldn't keep pace with a 4-year-old the way she needed to that evening. Days later, with search teams still combing the county for her daughter, Harris welcomed another child. Javeayah's father, Johmarea Harris, wasn't home when the call was made. He told local reporters afterward that his daughter wasn't the type to wander off. He described her as respectful, sociable, a child who said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," without being told to. He said he and Harris had no idea what could have happened to her. Then he said something that stood apart from everything else he told reporters that week. He said he'd already given detectives a name for something he'd noticed before any of this happened. People showing up near the house in the days beforehand. Unfamiliar, without explanation. He didn't elaborate further on camera, but it was enough to plant a question that would sit alongside every other detail investigators were now working to untangle. That single call, placed just before 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, would become the starting point of one of the largest searches Aiken County had ever seen. Within hours of that call, Aiken County Sheriff's deputies were on scene, and by morning, the response had grown far beyond a single department. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division joined the search that first night. By 11 the next morning, the FBI's Columbia Field Office had been brought in as well, alongside State Highway Patrol and agencies from neighboring counties. Local police, emergency management crews, and volunteer fire departments followed. Within a day, more than 200 first responders were working the case in some capacity. The search area started small, the streets and properties surrounding Hillsborough and Ridgecrest, and expanded fast. Search teams moved through wooded lots, drainage ditches, backyards, and open fields. A helicopter circled overhead. Drone units mapped the ground from above. By the second day, more than 3,000 acres had been covered. By the fourth, that number passed 5,000. All of it happened during a summer heat wave, with the heat index climbing near and at times above 100 degrees, conditions that made the search both more urgent and more difficult for the people conducting it. Bethel Baptist Church, close to the family's home, opened its doors as a staging ground. Search crews used it to rest, rehydrate, and regroup between shifts. It became, in effect, the unofficial headquarters of the entire operation, a place where exhausted volunteers and officers passed each other in silence, waiting for news that never came. The sheriff's office made a decision early on that some in the community questioned. They restricted public participation in the search itself. Deputies stopped vehicles leaving the area for questioning. Residents who wanted to join the search on their own were turned away at the perimeter. When asked why, officials were direct about the reasoning. An untrained volunteer could disturb evidence without realizing it or complicate a scene that investigators needed intact. It wasn't about distrust of the community. It was about protecting whatever the search might eventually turn up. By July the 3rd, 4 days in, the sheriff's office made an announcement that shifted the tone of the entire case. the large-scale, highly visible search, the helicopters, the acreage counts, the daily updates, would be scaled back. Officials said the investigation itself would continue, just with less of it happening in public view. For a case that had, until that point, been defined by its size and its urgency, that announcement read differently to anyone paying close attention. A search that had grown by the hour for 4 straight days was quietly stepping back from public view, and no one outside the investigation yet understood why. Saturday, July the 4th. One day after the visible search was scaled back, Sheriff Marty Sawyer called a press conference at the Aiken County Sheriff's Office. He opened by telling reporters this was the hardest announcement of his 36 years in law enforcement. Then he delivered it. Investigators, he said, now believed Javeayah Harris was no longer alive, and that she had not been alive for some time before her name ever reached a 911 dispatcher. Their evidence indicated she had already been deceased for approximately 1 month before the call was made on June the 30th. Sawyer put it plainly. Every resource the county had, the helicopters, the search dogs, the hundreds of first responders working through a summer heat wave, had been mobilized for a search that, according to what investigators now believed, could never have ended the way the public was hoping for. Then came the arrests. Johmarea Harris, 23, was taken into custody and charged with homicide by child abuse. Michilae, 22, was charged with the same offense, along with a second charge, filing a false police report. Under South Carolina law, homicide by child abuse falls under Code Section 16-36T, a charge that applies when a child's death results from abuse or neglect carried out with extreme indifference to their life. It's one of the most serious charges in the state's criminal code, carrying a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. The false report charge against Herring was what reframed the entire case. It meant investigators didn't believe this was simply a tragedy that had gone unreported. It meant they believed the call placed on June the 30th, the one that triggered a 4-day search across thousands of acres, described events that, according to the charge, had not happened the way they were described. Arrest warrants later confirmed how investigators reached that conclusion. According to those documents, the case was built in part on a confession from Herring, along with a separate confession from Harris, corroborating what had happened inside their home in the weeks leading up to that call. Both parents were booked into the Aiken County Detention Center that Saturday. Sawyer told reporters additional charges could still be filed as the investigation continued. For a county that had spent 4 days searching with the hope of bringing a 4-year-old home safely, the answer they received instead was a homicide investigation and 2 arrests of the 2 people who had spoken to reporters and searchers all week as her worried, waiting parents. Behind the arrests announced on July the 4th was an investigation that had been running on 2 tracks at once, one visible to the public and one that wasn't. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, had been involved from the earliest hours of the case, working alongside Aiken County investigators. As the search wore on, SLED opened a public tip line, asking anyone with information, no matter how small it seemed, to come forward. That tip line became one of the quieter but more important tools in the case, gathering pieces of information the public search itself never surfaced. One of those pieces led investigators somewhere the news cameras weren't watching. Before settling in Aiken County, Harris and Herring had lived in Chester and Union counties, and investigators began working those areas as part of the broader case, following the family's history rather than just their current address. It was a shift that told investigators this case wasn't going to be solved by searching the ground around one house. It required tracing the family's movements over months, not days. That shift in focus became public on July the 4th, when Sawyer confirmed investigators were no longer treating the Aiken neighborhood as the most likely location connected to Javeayah. Their attention had moved instead toward Fairfield County, more than 80 miles away, a wooded area near a reservoir the investigation would come to focus on directly. The forensic work behind the arrests relied heavily on DNA analysis conducted through SLED's laboratory. Investigators used standard forensic testing procedures to confirm biological relationships and corroborate the timeline they were building. The kind of lab work that takes days, sometimes longer, and rarely makes headlines the way an arrest does, but forms the backbone of a case like this one. Court documents connected to the arrests laid out a specific time frame. According to the affidavit, the abuse investigators allege led to Javeayah's death occurred sometime between May the 1st and June the 15th, a window of roughly 6 weeks, ending more than 2 weeks before that first 911 call was ever placed. That time frame is what turned this from a missing persons case into something far more complicated. It meant investigators believed the version of events described to dispatchers on June the 30th didn't align with what their evidence showed. And it meant the 4 days the public spent searching for Javeayah were 4 days spent searching for someone who, if that time frame holds, had already been gone for weeks before anyone called for help. By the time Sawyer stood in front of reporters to announce the arrests, this was the case investigators had already built, quietly, across multiple counties, using forensic science, prior records, and a tip line the public never saw the results of, until it was too late to matter to the search itself. Both parents appeared in court that Sunday, one day after their arrests, separately and without attorneys. Michilae Herring's hearing came first, just after 10:30 that morning. Magistrate Judge Ronald Thornton asked her a series of routine questions, the kind used to determine whether a defendant qualifies for a court-appointed attorney. She told him she worked for Transcom, paid bi-weekly, earning around $1,300 each pay period. When Thornton asked who else lived in her household, she answered simply, the father, and said he worked for DHL. Based on that income, Thornton ruled she made too much to qualify for a public defender. She would need to secure her own attorney, or represent herself until she did. On the charge of homicide by child abuse, Thornton told her plainly that a magistrate court doesn't have the authority to set bond for that offense. It would have to go before a circuit court judge instead. And because the false report charge was tied directly to the homicide charge, that meant no bond could be set on either count. Not that day, not in that courtroom. She would remain in custody. Her first full court appearance was scheduled for September the 18th, at 9 in the morning. Johmarea Harris's hearing followed that afternoon, just before 2 o'clock, under the same judge. He gave similar answers, DHL Bridgestone, though he said he wasn't certain exactly what he earned in a given week. When Thornton asked who shared his household, Harris answered quietly, his girlfriend, and then, after a pause, his child. Like Herring, Harris was found to exceed the income threshold for a public defender. And like Herring, the homicide charge against him meant Thornton had no authority to set bond. That decision, too, would fall to a circuit court judge, a hearing required to take place within 30 days. Both parents left that courtroom the same way they'd entered it, in custody, without bond, without an attorney standing beside them. 2 separate hearings, one after the other, that ended with the same outcome, delivered by the same judge, for 2 people who, 1 week earlier, had been publicly searching for their daughter alongside everyone else. No trial date has been set. September the 18th marks the start of the legal process, not the end of it, the first of what will likely be many appearances before this case ever reaches a courtroom for trial. Thursday, July the 9th. Sheriff Marty Sawyer returned to the podium at the Aiken County Sheriff's Office, this time flanked by nearly 30 members of his staff, many wearing pink, Javeayah's favorite color. He confirmed what investigators had been working toward since shifting their search outside Aiken County. Some of Javeayah's remains had been recovered from Cedar Creek Reservoir in Fairfield County, an area also known locally as Stumpy Pond. DNA analysis confirmed those remains were consistent with being the biological child of Javeayah Harris and Michilae Herring. Sawyer told reporters that forensic evidence and statements gathered during the investigation showed deliberate efforts had been made, after Javeayah's passing, to prevent investigators from recovering her and understanding what happened. He did not go into detail about the methods involved. What he did confirm was the outcome, that because of those efforts, investigators do not expect to locate all of her remains. Some details of this case, he said, may never be fully known. As a result, both parents now face an additional charge, destruction and desecration of human remains, added on top of the homicide by child abuse charges already filed against them. Sawyer, visibly emotional throughout the press conference, called it one of the most difficult cases his office has ever investigated. He said something else too, deliberately and without hesitation. He would not refer to Harris and Herring as this child's mother and father. In his words,
I will not refer to them as mom and dad or mother or father. They don't deserve that title.
They hadn't earned that title. He also addressed the community directly, thanking them for the compassion and patience they'd shown throughout an investigation that had, by that point, stretched far beyond what anyone expected when the first search began. For the department, for the searchers who had spent 4 days combing thousands of acres, and for a community that had shown up again and again, this update didn't bring closure. It brought confirmation of something more difficult than what anyone had feared going into that Thursday morning, and a clearer picture of just how far this case had moved from where it started. In the days that followed each new development in this case, Aiken County didn't step back. It kept showing up. The first vigil came on Sunday, July the 5th, one day after the arrests, held at the alley in downtown Aiken. People who had never met Javeayah or her family stood together, held candles, and spoke. One woman in the crowd said something that stayed with many who were there, that when it comes to protecting children, circumstances shouldn't matter, and neither should anything else. Just outside Javeayah's home on Hillsborough Street, a small memorial began to take shape around the mailbox. A teddy bear, then more. Balloons, flowers, candles. That memorial didn't stay small. By the following week, it had grown into a gathering point the whole community kept returning to. A second, larger vigil followed on July the 9th, the same day Sawyer confirmed Javeayah's remains had been found. Hundreds gathered that evening at an event center on Shiloh Heights Road. The vigil was organized by two longtime friends, Christy Pace and Tanya Kitchings, neither of whom had known Javeayah personally. Pace told reporters she simply couldn't let this happen without the community responding. A message was delivered that night by Pastor Joshua Stallings of Remnant Ministries. The crowd sang hymns together and closed with Amazing Grace. Afterward, many walked from the event center to Javeayah's home, adding what they'd brought that night to the memorial already growing there. A third vigil followed the next evening in neighboring Union County, tied to the family's history in that area, where attendees were asked to bring a teddy bear, a lawn chair, and water. In the weeks since, child advocacy voices in Aiken have used this case to speak more broadly about prevention. Aaron Milam, executive director of the Child Advocacy Center of Aiken, told local reporters that changes in a child's behavior, sleep, eating, or hygiene are often the clearest signs something is wrong, and that reporting a concern, even a mistaken one, is always the better choice over staying silent. Javeayah's newborn sibling, born just days into the search for her, was placed in the custody of her paternal grandmother, with South Carolina's Department of Social Services involved in that decision. A department spokesperson, Connolly Ann Ragley, noted that thousands of children remain in foster care across the state, and that the goal, whenever possible, is to place children with family. For a county that had spent 4 days searching for a little girl they believed they could still bring home, the vigils became something else entirely, a way for the community to honor Javeayah and to say her name in a way she deserved to hear while she was growing up. With the arrests made, the remains recovered, and additional charges filed, it would be easy to think this case is closed. It isn't. Legally, this is still the beginning. Johmarea Harris and Michilae Herring have been charged. They have not been convicted of anything. Under the law, both are presumed innocent, and the burden now falls on prosecutors to prove their case before a jury, not before the public. Some facts in this case are confirmed, established through court filings, forensic testing, and statements from the sheriff's office itself. Javeayah Harris is deceased, and investigators believe she had been for roughly a month before she was ever reported missing. Both parents face charges of homicide by child abuse. Michilae Herring faces an additional charge for filing a false police report. Both parents now face charges related to the destruction and desecration of human remains. DNA testing has confirmed that remains recovered from Cedar Creek Reservoir belong to their daughter. Other parts of this case remain open. Investigators have not detailed publicly the full sequence of what happened inside that home between early May and mid-June, beyond what's stated in the arrest warrants. It's not yet clear whether anyone outside the two parents knew what was happening, or whether they will face scrutiny as this case moves forward. Sheriff Sawyer has said additional charges may still be filed against Harris and Herring as the investigation continues. Neither parent has entered a plea. No trial date has been scheduled. September the 18th marks only their first full court appearance, not the start of a trial. A case of this weight in South Carolina typically takes many months, sometimes longer, before it ever reaches a jury. For now, what's certain is limited to what the evidence has already shown. Everything else waits on a courtroom that hasn't opened its doors on this case yet. Strip away the charges, the court dates, the forensic reports, and what remains is simple. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old. Everyone who knew her, from neighbors to the reporters who spoke with her family that first week, described her the same way. Talkative, respectful, quick to say, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," without being asked. Her favorite color was pink, a detail so many people in Aiken County chose to carry with them at the vigils held in her name. That's who she was. Whatever the courts ultimately decide about the two people charged in her death, that part of her story doesn't change, and it shouldn't be lost in the legal process still ahead. This case is not finished. There's a court date in September, the possibility of more charges, and a trial that, if it happens, is still a long way off. When there's real, confirmed information to report, we'll be here to cover it, the same way we've approached everything in this case so far. If you want to stay with this story as it develops, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. And if one detail here has stayed with you more than the rest, tell me in the comments. I read every one.